The Fall at Greywood Hall by Olga Kass.
Classic detective drama. The autumn wind lashed restlessly against the facade of Gravewood Hall, and the stately mansion responded with its customary melancholic creaking of wood and rustling of curtains. It was a house where secrets accumulated naturally, behind closed doors, beneath polite smiles, beneath the heavy scent of candle wax. Miss Eleanor Wayne had lived there since the death of her parents. She was approaching her 21st birthday, possessed a vast fortune, and was utterly alone in the world. She had no one save her guardian uncle, Mr. Arthur Blackwood, and her cousin Henry. Blackwood was a man admired by society. He was stern, respected, charitable in public, and cruel in ways too subtle for outsiders to notice. His voice was always calm. His clothes were always impeccable. Even his threats were uttered with politeness. He took great care to conceal the fact that the family's finances were in a precarious state. He had already found a simple and logical solution to set them right. "You will marry my son," he said to Eleanor one evening, standing by the fireplace in the drawing room. He explained that it was her direct duty to help the house that had given her shelter. Eleanor turned pale. It was so unexpected that she thought she must have misheard him. Then she realized he meant it. Her legs went weak, but she gathered her courage. "I won't marry him." Silence fell. At the piano, Henry Blackwood slowly closed the lid with deliberate care. Unlike his father, Henry possessed a certain charm, the dangerous kind that concealed rot beneath a mask of elegance. Women were instantly captivated by him. Men trusted him far too readily. However, having lived under the same roof as him for several years, Eleanor knew his true character. Unlike his father, he made no effort to hide his true nature from her. He did not pretend to be a gentleman. But previously she had not particularly feared him, as she considered her guardian to be a decent man and a reliable protector. And Henry, until this very evening, had paid her no attention at all. She had lived a life entirely separate from his. That is why everything happening now felt so unexpected and terrible. "My dear Eleanor," Henry Blackwood said gently, "surely you realize that this is a sensible decision." "I'd rather die than marry you," she blurted out. A cold flash flickered in Henry's eyes. Mr. Blackwood merely clasped his hands behind his back. "You're too emotional," he said. "And you're too young to understand what is best for you. You confuse stubbornness with independence. Young girls often make that mistake." Eleanor, however, stood her ground with a resolution that surprised even herself. From that evening onward, everything at Gravewood Hall changed. Doors that had previously remained open were now locked. Conversations trailed off when Eleanor entered a room. A look of unease appeared in the servants' eyes. But perhaps the servants had always behaved that way, and she had simply never noticed. Dr. Meredith, an elderly physician of dubious morals and expensive habits, began visiting the house with alarming frequency. One night, unable to sleep, Eleanor paused outside the library door and heard voices inside. "She's becoming increasingly unstable," Mr. Blackwood said. "Hallucinations," the doctor asked quietly. Occasionally, hysterical fits. Her poor mother suffered from the same thing. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She needs to be protected from herself, Blackwood continued smoothly. The law very clearly defines the duties of guardians towards people with mental disorders. Such people are a danger to those around them and incapable of managing their own affairs. There was a pause. Then the doctor asked, almost reluctantly, and if she resists confinement? Mr. Blackwood chuckled softly. My dear doctor, who would believe her? Eleanor fled silently back to her room, her whole body trembling. The next morning, she discovered that her windows had been nailed shut. The days dragged on like a nightmare from which she could not wake. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, avoided meeting her gaze. The maids whispered in corners. Only Mary, a young maid with frightened blue eyes, dared to show her any kindness. They're going to take you away, miss, she whispered one evening as she brought in tea. I heard Mr. Henry talking about a mental asylum. A mental asylum? The very words were tantamount to a death sentence. I must be very careful, thought Eleanor. She began to watch her behaviour closely. She remained calm, polite, and composed with the servants, the gardeners, the grooms, the doctor, her guardian, Henry, and the villagers who delivered provisions to the house. She smiled, let the barbs and insinuations pass unnoticed, and refused to rise to veiled provocations. The guardian frowned. Henry raged. They could find no reason to lock her away. The story of her madness was beginning to fall apart. And at night, alone, Eleanor frantically mulled over her situation. This could not continue forever. But what could she do? She was an orphan and had no influential friends to whom she could turn for help. Then, Eleanor began to notice other things. A bitter taste at the bottom of her glass, a strange dizziness after meals. Once she awoke in the middle of the night and found someone standing outside her bedroom door, listening. She rose, grabbed a chair with trembling hands, and silently wedged it beneath the handle. Were they trying to frighten her into madness, or did they truly intend to kill her? She began carefully monitoring what she ate and drank, barricaded her bedroom door with a heavy chest, and slept fully clothed. And she did all this without betraying the slightest suspicion that she understood what was happening. But she realized with terrifying clarity that this game of cat and mouse could not continue forever. If she stayed at Gravewood Hall, they would destroy her, one way or another. Eleanor decided to run away. She had her travelling purse and her mother's jewellery. She would go somewhere no one knew her, sell some of the jewellery, and lie low until she came of age in 6 months' time. For now, she had to pretend to be unwell. She complained of weakness, stayed in bed for long stretches, and feigned apathy and a lack of appetite. Let their vigilance weaken. Let them think their plan was succeeding. She needed time. An opportunity to escape presented itself a week later. Henry was, as usual, amusing himself in London. Mr. Blackwood had also left the estate. Business required his presence at a distant property, and such journeys usually kept him away for several days. Only Dr. Meredith and the servants remained in the house. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Eleanor slipped from her room wearing a dark travelling dress and cloak, a small leather bag clutched in her hands. She moved slowly and cautiously down the corridor, trying not to let the floorboards creak. Her heart pounded. Every shadow seemed alive. In every dark corner she imagined faint movement. She reached the wide staircase, began descending, and had nearly reached the bottom when suddenly a quiet voice emerged from the darkness below. Well, that is disappointing. Her heart seemed to stop. Mr. Blackwood stepped into the pale glow of the lamp in the hall. He had been waiting for her. It's a trap, Eleanor realized in horror. It has all been arranged. A ring of keys glinted in his hand. The doors are securely locked. I feared you might do something foolish, he said calmly. Eleanor instinctively stepped backwards. Please, let me pass. You are not in a position to leave this house. He began slowly climbing the stairs towards her. There was something terrifying about his composure. No anger, no shouting, only certainty. Then, with icy horror, Eleanor realized that he intended to kill her now, to stage an accident. He had changed his plan. You can't do this, she whispered. My dear girl, he replied softly, I already am. And he seized her wrist. Eleanor screamed and struggled desperately. She managed to wrench herself free and, gasping for breath, ran up the stairs. At the top steps, he caught her again. In blind panic, she pushed him. Everything happened in an instant. Mr. Blackwood staggered backwards. His hands released her. He reached desperately for the banister. For one terrible moment, his face contorted, not with rage, but with astonishment. Then he fell, tumbling violently down the staircase. The sound of his body striking the floor below echoed like a dull crack. Silence followed. Eleanor stared downward in horror.
Mr. Arthur Blackwood lay motionless at the foot of the stairs.
Then he opened his eyes, groaned faintly, twitched once, and became still in an unnatural position. Dead. A gasp escaped her lips. Then another sound made her blood run cold. Applause. Slow, sustained. Henry Blackwood stood in the doorway of the dining room, watching. My poor Eleanor, he said quietly. By morning the police had arrived. Henry looked magnificent in his grief, reserved, pale, heartbroken. My father devoted his entire life to protecting her, he said sadly to Inspector Hale. Unfortunately, her mental state has been unstable for some time. Eleanor tried to speak, but every word Henry uttered sounded plausible, even to her. Henry had anticipated everything. The doctor confirmed her supposed instability. Mr. Blackwood's documents concerning her mental decline were discovered neatly arranged in the library. The butler admitted hearing arguments between guardian and ward. The case appeared hopeless. The newspapers pounced upon the scandal with relish. The insane heiress of Gravewood Hall, the midnight murderess. However, something troubled Inspector Hale. He decided to question Eleanor once more. She was pale and tense, but she had regained her composure and her ability to speak clearly. She knew nothing of the machinery of justice, but she understood instinctively that only the truth could save her. When the inspector entered, she said quietly, "It was a trap." The inspector regarded her silently, waiting for her to continue. But Eleanor said nothing more. She merely held his gaze calmly. That was not how unstable people behaved. That was not how mad people behaved. At last the inspector broke the silence himself. "Did you kill your guardian?" Eleanor paused again.
Then she said,
"You have asked the wrong question." For a moment panic seized her. He might become angry. He might simply send the case to trial. There was already more than enough evidence against her. But instinct told her he was a man who genuinely wished to know the truth. Inspector Hale gave a faint, wry smile. "And what, in your opinion, is the right question?" "What were my guardian, Arthur Blackwood, and I doing on the staircase at 2 o'clock in the morning?" The inspector opened her file and leafed through the papers. "According to Mr. Blackwood, Jr., you suffered a violent fit of madness. You attacked his father at the top of the stairs while he was on his way to bed, for no apparent reason. The doctor confirms you have suffered similar fits before." Eleanor's
thoughts raced.
This was her only chance. "Do these papers mention what I was wearing?" she asked. "No." "Do they mention whether any of my belongings were found on the stairs, or what was in my guardian's pockets?" "No." "Do they explain why Arthur Blackwood and his son were at the estate that night when they were expected to be away for several days?" The inspector studied her carefully. "You have an unusual way of thinking. However, whatever the answers to those questions may be, they remain circumstantial evidence. They do not remove suspicion from you. But they will prove that Henry Blackwood lied in his testimony, and he, as I understand it, is the prosecution's principal witness. Inspector, you are an experienced man. What happens when the prosecution's principal witness is proven to be lying?" Inspector Hale looked at her with newfound respect. "How do you know such expressions?" he asked quietly. The inspector returned to the estate, examined Eleanor's room, and questioned the servants individually. He asked Eleanor's questions, and several of his own.
The servants answered nervously, avoiding his gaze. Fear and uncertainty had ruled that household for far too long.
Inspector Hale learned that Miss Eleanor had been wearing a traveling dress and cloak. He learned that her small leather traveling bag had been found halfway down the staircase. A ring of keys to every door in the house had lain beside the body. A length of rope and packets of medicinal powder, later identified as potassium bromide, had been discovered in Mr. Blackwood's pockets. The label bore Dr. Meredith's name, a massive dose. The doctor became visibly uncomfortable when asked why he had prescribed such a quantity. The servants confirmed they had not expected the masters of the house to return that night. Their tongues gradually loosened. Mary spoke first, then Mrs. Dalton. At last the butler, fearing the consequences of silence, told the truth. Mr. Blackwood had deliberately isolated Eleanor. Her windows had been nailed shut from the outside. Henry had repeatedly spoken of controlling her inheritance. One maid confessed to overhearing father and son discussing how long they could keep the girl under their thumb. Then came the final blow. A footman testified that shortly after the fatal fall, he had seen Henry standing over his father's body without making any attempt to summon help. And what exactly was he doing? Inspector Hale asked quietly. The footman hesitated. He looked pleased, sir. He was smiling. Suspicion shifted instantly. Henry had witnessed the fall. Instead of calling for help, he had allowed his father to die, and then attempted to frame Eleanor entirely. Who knew? Perhaps he had even engineered the fall itself. As the investigation continued, financial records revealed enormous debts. If Eleanor were convicted, Henry, as her nearest relative, would gain complete control of her fortune. And the case against Eleanor began to collapse. Henry Blackwood was arrested before the end of the week. Although Arthur Blackwood's death was ultimately ruled accidental, Henry stood trial for failing to render assistance, tampering with evidence, providing false testimony leading to a miscarriage of justice, and attempting to send an innocent woman to the gallows. At trial, he remained charming until the very end. But charm, as Inspector Hale later remarked, is powerless against irrefutable facts. A few months later, Eleanor Wayne came of age. Gravewood Hall was no longer bound by the family trust. Her solicitors settled the debts and secured the estate in her name. Later, Inspector Hale paid Eleanor a visit. She was no longer a prisoner in that house. She was its rightful mistress. "I'm so glad to see you," Eleanor said with a smile. "And I always shall be," she added softly, emphasizing the word always. Hale looked slightly taken aback. People in my line of work do not often hear words like that. "You saved me. You believed me when no one else did." "Alas, I cannot take much credit for that," said the inspector. "You saved yourself. And you taught me something important." "What was that?" "To ask the right questions, and never to underestimate a woman's intelligence. You are stronger and more logical than most men I know." Now it was Eleanor who seemed flustered, though she did not protest. "Thank you, Inspector," she said simply. Then her gaze shifted to the newspapers lying open upon the table. "So, was he found guilty?" "Yes," Hale replied. "On all counts. He will never trouble you again." "I know. And I heard Dr. Meredith lost his license." They fell silent. Nothing more needed to be said. Spring sunlight streamed through the windows, lending the old rooms an almost carefree air. The curtains stood wide open. The locks had been removed from the doors. No maid trembled at the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Laughter drifted upward from the kitchens below. "How greatly things have changed here," said Hale. "It is difficult to believe this was once a place of sinister plots and quiet terror." He glanced around the brightened room. "Are you never afraid to remain here alone? Are you not haunted by ghosts of the past?" "No," Eleanor replied calmly. "The evil has been driven out." Then, with quiet pride, she added, "The villagers say Gravewood Hall has finally become what it never was before." She looked toward the sunlit windows. "A home."